Welcome back, everyone. Previously, we've looked at entire stories as well as individual details within Islamic texts that fit very well into the context of a type of Jewish mysticism called Merkavah mysticism. Frequently spelled with a B but pronounced with a V, Merkavah, or throne mysticism, refers to mystical ascents, theoretically to the very throne room of God, hence the name. For a more thorough explanation, see the videos in the description box. But for now, what I'd like to do is review some of this material for context. Surah 27 describes the Queen of Sheba being fooled by Solomon. However, as I describe in the video Quran Mysticism and the Ignorance of Allah, this story is simply an adaptation of the Rabbinic story of the four who entered paradise. The story is contained, among other places, in the Talmud, a well of tradition from which the authors and compilers of the Islamic texts drank deeply. It goes without saying that juxtaposing Solomon with Merkavah mysticism is strikingly anachronistic. Next, a number of hadith I discussed in the video Muhammad the Mystic and the Boy Under the Blanket refer quite clearly to the practice found throughout Merkavah literature of cloaking oneself during a mystical experience. The boy portrayed in these hadith is Jewish, precisely as we would expect. His visions, also not surprisingly, include a throne over water. Recall the water test we just discussed, as well as Surah 11:7. No surprises here. But it is surprising that Muhammad is depicted in a way that is less than flattering, trying to sneak up on the boy while the boy is cloaked in a blanket in a state of mystical contemplation. The boy's mother alerts him when she sees Muhammad, at which point he and the boy have a conversation. To further the embarrassment, Muhammad tests the boy's psychic powers by asking him a series of questions. One of those questions concerns what Muhammad is thinking. Curiously, the boy passes the test. Muhammad, apparently quite surprised, is challenged by the boy to testify to his apostleship. Muhammad's response is vague and less than impressive. So far, we've reviewed a couple of things. We've seen a clear repurposing of the water test. We've seen increased mental psychic abilities, a cloaked individual having a revelatory experience. And just to clarify, one function of the cloaking or the covering was to protect the individual from the radiance of supernatural beings encountered on the mystical journey. And finally, we don't have any time to review the mystical background to Surah 20, but that's a very relevant video in this context as well, so I'll just mention it in passing. Again, links are in the description box. Mysticism is therefore an important part of the cognitive environment of some Islamic texts. That's the end of our review. Now, there is some disagreement in the traditional narrative about which Surah Muhammad received first. While many argue for Surah 96, at least some companions asserted that Surah 74 may have formed part of the first revelation. Regardless of which one it was, the same hadith are generally cited as the traditional background to Muhammad's first mystical experience. The hadith in Bukhari is very long, and it's also well known, so we'll just use the summarized version from the Study Quran. The Messenger of God said, "I passed a month at Mount Hira, and when my stay came to an end, I came down. While I was walking, I heard a voice from the sky. I looked up toward the sky, and behold, I saw the same angel who came to me in the cave of Hira, sitting on a stool between the sky and the earth. I was so terrified by him that I fell down on the ground. Then I went to my wife and said, 'Cover me, cover me.' They covered me, and then God revealed." Surah 74, 1-5. Let's add that to another hadith which also emphasizes covering, though it does so to address the problem of jealousy so prominent among Muhammad's wives. "Revelation has never come to me under the blanket of any of you apart from her," namely Aisha. And of course, 2 surahs in the Quran begin by addressing a cloaked messenger. Note that we have an angel, a revelatory experience, and the urgency of being covered. While explanations have been sought individually for each of these details, especially the covering, all of them together fit very neatly into the context of Jewish mysticism. In fact, not only are we able to point to isolated adaptations of Merkavah mysticism in places like Surah 20, where the golden calf moves, or the water test in Surah 27. And not only can we see specific figures like the Jewish mystic that Muhammad attempted to spy on, but the very story of Muhammad's first revelation can coherently be understood against the background of Jewish mysticism. In pre-Islamic rabbinic literature, all of these same details are given in similar stories. Some of these stories are contained in a mystical collection of texts studied intensively by scholars, particularly since David Halperin's work beginning in the 70s. These stories are fluid, indicating to scholars that they were circulated orally for some time. While this story exists in other texts like the Tosefta and the Palestinian Talmud, here's the version preserved in the Babylonian Talmud. It's lengthy, so I'll summarize. A student asked his teacher, Yohanan ben Zakkai, to expound the Merkavah to him. His teacher refused, using a typical response. Only a sage expounds the Merkavah. This challenges the student to expound it himself. At this point, the teacher dismounts, cloaks himself, and the show begins with spectacular results, including angels, and in some versions, trees that quite literally talk. Some of you will note that in the Hadith, trees also talk. And of course, finally, an angel speaks. The mystical experiences of these rabbis thus have striking parallels in the experiences of the Prophet of Islam himself. Now, let's explore two possibilities. First, the story of Muhammad's revelations in the Hadith are based in whole or in part on fact. In this case, the Prophet of Islam used Jewish mystical techniques to acquire his revelations. This is not what Muslims are taught to believe, since recognizing pre-Islamic influences in this way is generally regarded as unorthodox, if not heretical. Additionally, many of us are aware that early Muslims expended great effort in trying to eliminate pre-Islamic influence, including and particularly Jewish influence. As such, they're forced to reject all such notions of pre-Islamic influence, choosing, of course, other reasons that are more in line with tradition. But many viewers may be wondering about a second possibility. These stories about Muhammad's revelations were fabricated. That would beg the question, why? I think the answer is very simple, given the larger function that these and other similar stories served in Jewish literature. David Halperin comments on the unfortunate lack of detail about what's actually spoken by the rabbis in many of these mystical stories. But why do the narrators fail to tell us what Yohanan's disciples actually said about the Merkavah? Because it was not their purpose to tell us any such thing. What they wanted was to show the wondrous greatness of the ancient sages. If the function of these stories was preserved along with them as they were integrated into Islamic sources, then the purpose of such stories is clear. They attempt to portray Muhammad as similar to the great sages of past centuries. This portrayal would have been easily recognizable by people familiar with Jewish tradition preserved in extra-biblical literature, a cognitive environment, of course, in which both the Quran and Hadith are firmly situated. This observation is simple and straightforward. But against the notion of a complete fabrication, recall that the Hadith featuring Muhammad and the Jewish boy mystic are terribly embarrassing. Muhammad appears uncertain, outclassed, and awkward. It's very difficult to imagine why anyone would have made those stories up. But regardless of how much history these stories preserve, to me, at least one conclusion is certain. Jewish mysticism forms the context within which we should read these stories of Muhammad's first revelation. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.